We're reading Parashat Tazria this week, Ezrat Hashem, and we'll talk about a discourse here. I mean, the Ishbitz's voice is a little bit complex, how he says it. We'll just focus on one point, like we like focusing on one, also brief, relatively one short point from within the Torahs of the Mea Shilach. He says, again, the Parasha starts, Ishaki Tazria, and it's talking about the purity of a woman who gives birth. And there's a mashal or a midrash, a mashal in the midrash. The midrash brings a mashal about this, the mashal, the allegory that the midrash brings is like a person when he writes to the king, he writes for a request, so he puts it on a shabby parchment, like a piece of paper, like any note you find. You write a note, so you might use not the best piece of paper, not the highest quality piece of paper. So the midrash allegorizes the way a person prays to Hashem to a person writing a note on that shabby piece of parchment, on that not so mechubad, it's not so respectful, and that's how the midrash explains the Torah, or what the Torah describes about a woman's impurity, or that when a person, and so we'll go into how the Ishbitz already describes how he interprets this midrash. He says that a person's feminine stance in front of Hashem, that how a person stands like needily in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in prayer. And every prayer always positions a person in a needy manner in front of Hashem. So he says that usually that neediness, again, every prayer is a neediness. So the expression of our neediness is usually conveyed on a shabby medium. So there's always a certain sort of a non-respectable or not high quality or high society manner. It's not a respectable manner, the way or the medium that we use in order to express our neediness. So just the neediness itself, like the feminine stance in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is a blessed thing, but it tends to appear on a not so high quality medium. And that's what the allegory is saying in the midrash, and he'll explain it. So he says the vort he says is like this. It's a very profound concept. It's also general in Chasidut. I mean, the vort he's describing here is what we usually call itkafia, the basic idea that everything's evolving around is the understanding of what's called in Chasidut itkafia. So we'll say a brief interpretation of that, and then we'll see how he mentions it here. And the term of itkafia. So if anybody here has been studying Chasidut for any long while or any even bit, so he's familiar with this term. It's very, very popular, especially in Chabad Chasidut. But it's not always understood correctly. So we'll explain it a little bit more precisely. I mean, the typical attitude of how you describe what itkafia is that a person subdues his wills by overcoming them. For instance, you want to do so. You want to eat a chocolate bar, and you don't. You force yourself. And the word itkafia literally means to forcefulness. So anything you do in a forceful manner, like something that's initiated, not something natural. So, like pivoting yourself up against your natural tendencies, like you want a bar of chocolate, you don't eat that chocolate bar, you refrain from eating the chocolate bar, and you do that again by pivoting some strength up against yourself. So that's called itkafia. But as we'll explain again, if you understand the simplest interpretation of Chabad, it's not just a technical deed. What itkafia is a certain sort of mentality. There's a very famous story we like saying in this context from the third Lubavitcher Rebbe. This is going about 150 years back. The Tzemach Tzedek, he bared the same name as the Rebbe, Menachem Mendel. So he's not even the original. Actually, the original Menachem Mendel was Priya Aretz. He was a friend of the Alter Rebbe, of the Tzemach Tzedek's grandfather. But he's the middle name. There are three great Rebbes with this name. There are many more, but in the Chabad dynasty, there are three. Even the original one, there's a Menachem Mendel Mivitebsk. So he's not officially in the lineage of Chabad, but the Rebbe counts him in the lineage. So again, the second name bearer of this name, Menachem Mendel, a very Hasidic name, his name is Tzemach Tzedek. He wrote a book called the Tzemach Tzedek, and there's a famous story about him that when he was very young, 5-6 years old, and he was roaming around the koilel, like where all the Hasidim were learning, all the elderly, big Hasidim were sitting and learning Torah, and he was a young boy, and he was roaming around, and he was holding an apple in his hand, and he was crying his eyes out, mamash, like a young child, and like an infant cries. So this 5-year-old kid, the son of the Rebbe, or the grandson of the Rebbe, this is still in the time of his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, is walking around the shul, where everybody's learning and crying, and one of the, so again, it's probably making a ruckus. So one of these elderly giants of Hasidim turns to the tzimach, like this young boy, and he says, "Why are you crying?" So the grandson of the Rebbe, he says to him that I want an apple. I'm crying because I want an apple, and he's holding an apple in his hand. So immediately this elderly chassid tells him, "But you have an apple. You're holding it in your hand." So this young boy says to him that, "Nachon, I have an apple, that's right, but my grandfather, the Rebbe, told me that not everything you want you have to do. So I'm crying because I want an apple, but I can't, I won't. Okay, I don't feel like I have it because my grandfather said that you don't need to do everything you want." And this is the story. So again, that's a good image to have in mind. And this is like a foundation of education. This is how the Alter Rebbe educated, like anything a grandfather, like a great-grandfather says to a very young child. It's not like parents, like we hassle our kids all the time. But grandparents, they don't hassle their kids, their grandkids all the time. And so only if they ever say anything, like what I say to my kids, I don't know how important it is, but my parents say to my kids is usually pearls of wisdom. So same thing here. If this is what the Alter Rebbe, like one of the few statements the Alter Rebbe chose to say to his grandson. So it's a fundamental point of education. Now, if you've studied Chabad before, then you've understood it. But this picture, this image, depicts it very well. Like a child walking around and crying, right, because he wants an apple. He's holding an apple. And why? Because my grandfather told me that not everything you want you have to do. And that penetrated him. And so what is itkafia? If we kind of try to sense the sensation here of this story. So it's not just a matter of whether or not you eat something, it's a certain mentality. It's like an awareness that and not everything you want you have to do. So it's even a practice. You could say it's like an exercise that Hasidim took part in throughout the ages. They exercised itkafia. Every one of us should learn to exercise this in your life, where you pivot yourself up against your intuitive desires. Now, it doesn't have to be a huge thing. Just like this example, I want an apple, but I won't eat the apple. So again, it could very well be that many times doing this could switch around, as we'll explain. But what it's really representing or depicting to me is it's going up against my most existential assumptions. That's what really Yitkafia is there to do. That a person walks around in life and he takes his own self or legitimacy of his own existence. So I want something, so I do it. And it's taken for granted so naturally. It's never under any criticism or scrutiny. I have an apple, I can eat an apple. So it never comes to mind that I shouldn't do it. So it's not a dietary practice. It's not even a matter of not eating sweets or candy or ice cream. It's just a practice where a person kind of wants to note or remind himself throughout life that the goes without saying assumption of legitimacy, you don't have to live by it. It's undermining like a very existential experience that follows us all through life. I'm pivoting myself up against the most mundane, it could be the most mundane thing in life. It's like I feel like doing something, and like the example in the Talmud, which the Alter Rebbe brings in Tanya for this, is that it says that in the time of the Talmud, a couple of thousand years ago, so the sages used to eat their meal. Back then it was customary to it. Today we usually eat 3 meals a day: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So it was 2,000 years ago, people used to customarily eat 2 meals, like a brunch, like a late breakfast, and another meal at sunset, right before there was no light out anymore. That was the natural course of things. But it says that the average person would eat his morning meal at the 10th hour of the day, 10 o'clock-ish. And Talmidei Chachamim, these sages, they would make a point of eating their meal at 12 o'clock. 2 hours later than the customary time. Now, why would they do this? So you could think that they were in their studies and they wanted to accumulate another couple of hours. But it explicitly says that their daily studies overlaps. So they studied before this meal, and they also studied after this meal. So they didn't actually gain any net time in their studies. So they studied up until this point of eating, and they studied after this point of eating. So there was no gain by just prolonging the meal or delaying the meal. So why did they do it? So this is an example the Alter Rebbe brings, that they did it only in order to, again, to pivot themselves up against the natural assumptions that you're sitting and you're eating and you're studying, or you're doing something and you're hungry. So there's this, like, it goes without saying, if I'm hungry, I'm going to eat. So just to tell myself, no, you don't have to eat when I'm hungry. Now that's why it's so difficult as well. This is the point we wanted to make. This is the point he stresses in the Torah here, that not eating an apple, when you understand the significance of what we're describing, can become an existential challenge, because you feel like you're aware that you're not. It's not that you're losing an apple here. You're not giving up on an apple. You're giving up on an existential assumption. So, like, the unconscious of your soul realizes that a willingness to give. This is, again, this is the reason why giving up on the most mundane desire in life can become an exceedingly challenging thing. It can be very, very. If a person can feel like, mamash, that his soul is being ripped out of his body because he's giving up on a chocolate bar. It's not just the sugar rush. It's the assumption that not doing what seems the most, again, presumable, goes without saying, most legitimate assumption, when I pivot myself up against it. So I realize that this is an existential change in the proportions of my priorities. It's a priority change. It can change my whole life. If I admit, if I'm willing to not do what I feel like doing, and, like, say it's not, even if you're hungry, it's not the most important thing in the world, you can just push off your meal. So by doing that, I'm pivoting up against the entire proportion of my priorities in life. I mean, that's a slippery slope there. You never know where you're going to find yourself at the end. You might find yourself, living in shlichus now and doing things for other people all day long. So subconsciously, when a person gives up, even on the most mundane desire that he has, it could feel extremely difficult, because he feels that his mental willingness to abheed to such a notion is actually waving a white flag and surrendering the most existential assumptions of his priorities. Okay, so this is a very profound concept. This is why Hasidim made such a fuss about itkafi, that a person has to practice this to a certain extent in his life. Again, not to take a diet or to eat less apples or less chocolate, but in order to undermine these groundbreaking assumptions that whatever you feel like doing, you have to do. And it's so embedded in our unconscious, the legitimacy that we presume about our desires, that if we don't actively practice undermining them, then they can run our entire routine of life without us even noticing. And where do you feel that? You feel that when you try to pivot yourself up against even the most mundane desire. It can feel like an existential, like someone's putting a gun to your head. So the reason it feels that way is because you realize somewhere, like semi-consciously, that upheating to such a notion is actually undermining all the legitimacy of your life. So it's very hard just to give up that chocolate bar. Now we want that. I mean, if you understand all, like, you have a sense of what we're describing, so you realize it becomes a very, very valuable commodity to gain. Like that loss of that apple. You lose a little tiny chocolate bar, but you can, by doing so, you can pivot your entire proportions of all of your priorities. So again, if that pivoting is something you want, like you want to change the proportions of your life, what's the main proportion of life? So that's where this all is leading up to. The main proportion of life is how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu is valuable to me. How much value he upholds in my life. How much do I sense that what he wants or his presence is something that has volume in my experience, and how much am I just full of myself? I'm just constantly fretting over myself. So that's the main volumes we want to pivot up again in life. We want to give HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we want to give Hashem our faith. We want it to be something substantial, something that echoes into our reality, not just in the background of our life. And in order for that to happen, then we have to allow our attention to stray from our constant fretting over ourselves. Now, itkafi, like this practice of giving up on a chocolate bar is pivoting up against the core of those proportions of how much legitimacy, how much does it go without saying that your self is the most presumable legitimate thing in the world. So again, cracking that is the basis for enabling any person, any normal person, to be able to just notice HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to give him the time of day, like to grant him some volume in our life. So if I feel that HaKadosh Baruch Hu isn't so valuable, it's not so significant to me in my life, so that's always a result of being overly involved with myself. And I have to crack that in order to turn to Hashem and feel that it's something significant in my existence. Now, it's very difficult. So what the Mea Shilach says, now to return to our vort here, is that a prayer, this sort of turning to Hashem, feeling a sensation where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is significant, very often appears in the background of a certain, again, minor trauma. Like something happens in order to undermine your assumption of self-sustained self. So you could get the flu, or maybe you could win the lottery. It could be something good even, but something has to happen to undermine your constant of life, just the simple constant of life. And until that happens, you don't give the time of day to Hashem because you're so self-involved. We're all in our routine. Again, not because we're such horrible people. We don't have to be a narcissistic, crazy people. We presume that it's the most legitimate thing in the world to just be involved with ourselves because I'm who I am. So again, it's just so natural that the natural flow can go on and on and on. If nothing stops it, nothing halts that routine, then we'd never notice it. So very often turning to Hashem only appears like, I know you can't find a parking place, so you turn to Hashem. Something has to happen. So that's what he says here, that's the shabby parchment. That very often the neediness towards Hashem appears on the background of a very mundane circumstance. It had to happen. You had to, again, lose your parking place in order to realize that actually there is a Kadosh Baruch Hu in the world and I should turn to him. So very often it's a very shabby kind of context that pivots me towards a Kadosh Baruch Hu. So that's, if you're doing it like the Itkafia, the initiated Itkafia is like trying to initiate such a context, like making a point in life of moments where I undermine my flow of self-legitimacy. But if I don't do that, so very often in order to turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's a circumstantial, something has to happen. And that, he says, is the impure parchment which a pure turning, a pure notion comes from. So always, or on some level, our turning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because noticing Hashem always involves sidetracking my attention from myself. So there's always a side where the turning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the background is riding on a circumstance that allowed me to forget myself for a moment. So somebody has to cut me off in the street. There has to be some sort of mundane, unpleasant occurrence that enables me or allows me or like lifts my head up to notice Hashem. So the noticing of Hashem is a wonderful, pure thing, but it always rides on a moment of impurity. Impurity being, again, the mundane context that had to kind of pivot me away from myself to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So every turning, every note to Hashem is always written on a shabby piece of paper. That's the word he says here, in accordance with this midrash. So it's a very beautiful point to notice in life. So two things we can take from this. The first thing is just noticing that. Noticing how in life the most mundane predicaments, circumstances, it could be something very small, are the chariot that pivots us to notice HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, and then first of all, we can cherish these things. They're very, very valuable. Everything in life that kind of changes the flow or abrupts your constant, inevitable fretting over yourself, which we'd all be caught into that in the flow of our days if there weren't these circumstances constantly coming around. So we can cherish them and value them, that they enable us to notice, re-notice, remind us of Hashem's presence. And the other void is that if we understand this dynamic well enough, then we could even obtain or start practicing and initiate where we initiate such a practice, where we pivot ourselves up. So if I find myself overly confident with the legitimacy of eating some chocolate bar. Again, not for a diet, not dietary purposes. The opposite. I have some notion, like I want to say something. Somebody annoyed me, so I'm gonna. Obviously, I should tell him off. No, maybe it's not so obvious. You should tell him off. Who said that your pride is so important? Maybe you should just be. That's a great, much better than a chocolate bar. And not saying something you want, much more difficult as well. Not saying something that's on the tip of your tongue. And not because it's the wrong thing, just because that sensation of dire need to blurt out what feels like should be blurted out, okay, maybe not. Maybe you should pivot yourself up against that notion. And if you do that, then you'll realize that pivots you to notice Hashem. The undermining of your self-legitimacy automatically pronounces Hashem's presence. So you'll find yourself standing in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that prayer is riding on that pivot. So it's a good thing to initiate in your life. And at the very least, it happens to all of us. And to appreciate the circumstances that initiate it. And if it's a little bit more, we can initiate it in ourselves. So that's the word for Parashat Tazria, how there's a point of impurity which our pure turns to Hashem right on. Ezrat Hashem, so we should all have a good week and notice and appreciate all of the mundane. They should also all be very pleasant. That pivot us to Hashem, and also maybe initiate a few more in our own accord. Shavuot Tov to everybody.